A postal worker handed me a package and said, "She asked me to give this to you." Inside was a hard drive and a handwritten note from my daughter. "Go to our old restaurant. Do not tell your wife anything." I went completely still. My daughter had been gone for 5 years, and what happened when I got there? Thank you for joining me. Drop your city or country in the comments right now to boost this story. Don't forget to subscribe to Dad's Revenge Stories. Please note some fictional elements were added for entertainment purposes. Resemblance to any names or settings is completely accidental, but the message shared is useful. The coffee was already cold by the time I noticed it. That was how most mornings went these days. I would pour a cup, set it on the kitchen table, and then drift somewhere else in my head, out the window to the oak tree in the front yard, or back 30 years, to when this house smelled like pancakes on Saturdays, and a little girl with 2 missing front teeth would drag me out of bed before 7, because she said sleeping in was a waste of a perfectly good morning. I picked up the mug and drank the cold coffee anyway. 58 years of working with my hands had taught me not to waste things. Outside, Queens was doing what Queens did in October. The ginkgo trees along Hillside Avenue had turned the color of old gold, and the wind pushed their leaves in slow circles across the pavement. A delivery truck rumbled past. A dog barked twice and went quiet. Ordinary Tuesday morning sounds, the kind that used to feel like background music, and now felt like the whole show. Diane had left at 7:30 without saying goodbye. That was not unusual anymore. She would appear in the kitchen doorway, in her gray blazer, check something on her phone, say something about a meeting or a client call, and then the front door would close, and the house would settle back into its particular brand of silence. The kind of silence that is not peaceful, the kind that has weight to it. I told myself it was just how long marriages went sometimes. 2 people sharing a roof for 31 years. The friction of all those years smoothing everything down until there was nothing left to catch on. I told myself that on most mornings. On the mornings when my hands shook a little reaching for the mug, and my thoughts moved slower than they used to, and I had to stop and concentrate on things that once came without thinking, I told myself I was simply getting older. 63 years old, retired electrician, widower of a marriage that was not technically over, but felt in every room of this house like something that had already ended a long time ago. The doorbell rang at 8:15. I set down the mug and moved through the hallway, steadying myself briefly with one hand on the wall. My left knee had been giving me trouble since September. Another thing I blamed on age. I pulled open the front door. Frankie Ruiz was standing on the porch in his blue postal uniform, a padded envelope tucked under one arm and his gray cap pushed back on his head the way he always wore it, like a man who had never entirely made peace with the hat being part of the job. Frankie had been running this mail route for going on 18 years. He had delivered birthday cards for Clara when she was small, and the papers from the Veterans Administration when my father passed, and every piece of ordinary correspondence a life accumulates. He was the kind of man whose face you associated with good news simply because he was the one who brought it to your door. But Frankie was not smiling this morning. "Morning, Arthur." His voice came out careful, measured, like a man choosing each word the way you choose your footing on an icy step. "Frankie." I looked at the envelope under his arm. "Something for me." He pulled it out and held it with both hands, and for a moment he just stood there looking at the package and then at me, and the expression on his face was one I had not seen on Frankie Ruiz before. He looked like a man carrying something heavier than the object in his hands. "She came to Joey 3 months ago," he said. Joey was his son, 24 years old, who sometimes helped Frankie on the early morning runs. Came to him at the depot on a Tuesday, gave him this, and told him to make sure I was the one who delivered it. Personally. To you and no one else. He paused. "She made Joey swear on his mother's grave." My throat had gone dry. Who did? Frankie set the envelope in my hands. It was light. Almost nothing. Padded brown paper taped at the seams, and on the front, written in handwriting, I recognized before my brain had fully registered what I was seeing: my name. Arthur Hensley. The letters formed with that particular looping precision, the way she had written everything from grocery lists to birthday cards, careful and unhurried, like the writing itself mattered as much as the words. My chest seized so hard I pressed my free hand flat against the doorframe to keep myself upright. She told Joey to tell me, Frankie said, his voice dropping low, that she was sorry it took this long, and that you would understand why. I could not speak. My throat had closed around something enormous, and I could not get a single word past it. I stared at the handwriting on the envelope. Clara's handwriting. My daughter's handwriting. My daughter who had been dead for 5 years. Arthur. Frankie's hand landed on my shoulder, firm and warm. You need to sit down before you read that. I did not sit down. I tore open the envelope right there in the doorway, my fingers shaking so badly I nearly dropped it twice, and inside was a small black device, a hard drive no larger than a deck of cards, and beneath it, folded twice, a single sheet of white paper. I unfolded it. Her handwriting again. 3 sentences. Go to our old restaurant. Don't tell Diane. Don't tell anyone. I read it twice. Then I turned the paper over, because my hands would not stop moving, because I needed something to do with them, because my heart was slamming against my ribs with a force I had not felt in 5 years. On the back of the page, 4 words in Clara's handwriting, pressed deep into the paper, like she had needed to make sure they could not be erased. Dad, I'm alive. The world outside the front door kept going. The ginkgo leaves kept falling. The delivery truck had turned the corner and disappeared. Frankie stood on my porch with his cap in his hands, now his eyes red at the edges, watching me the way people watch someone when they are afraid the person might fall down. I did not fall down, but my knees came very close to making that decision for me. Frankie left without another word. I think he understood that there was nothing left to say, that whatever was happening on this porch had moved past the territory where words were useful. I heard his mail truck pull away from the curb, and then the street was quiet again, and I was standing alone in my own doorway, holding a hard drive and a piece of paper that had just rearranged everything I believed about the last 5 years of my life. I sat down on the front steps. Not because I decided to. My legs made the decision, and I followed their lead. The paper was still in my hand. I read those 4 words again, then a third time. Then I folded the sheet carefully along its original creases, the way Clara had folded it, and I pressed it flat against my chest with both palms, like I was trying to keep it from disappearing. 5 years ago, on a Thursday night in November, a state trooper had called me at 9:47 in the evening. I remembered the time because I had been watching the news, and the anchor had just finished saying something about a storm system moving up the eastern seaboard. And then my phone rang, and everything after that moment became the kind of memory that does not arrange itself in order. It comes in pieces. The trooper's voice flat and practiced and kind in the way that people are kind when they are delivering something irreversible. A vehicle registered to Clara Marie Hensley had gone off Route 9 near the Poughkeepsie Bridge. The water was fast. The search team was doing everything they could. They found the car. They did not find Clara. Presumed dead. That was the language they used. Presumed, as though even the state of New York was not entirely willing to commit to it in writing. But the death certificate came 6 weeks later, signed and official, and I had stood in our living room holding it, while Diane sat at the kitchen table going through Clara's bank statements to begin what she called closing out her affairs. I had thought at the time that Diane's efficiency was her way of grieving. Some people cry. Some people organize. I understood now that she had not been grieving at all. The funeral service was held at St. Anthony's on a gray Saturday in December. 41 people came. Clara's college roommate flew in from Portland and sobbed through the entire service. Dr. Okafor, who had been our family physician for 2 decades, sat in the third row with her hands folded and her eyes closed for most of the eulogy. Old neighbors from the block people Clara had babysat for as a teenager, 2 of her co-workers from the nonprofit, where she had spent 3 years doing financial advocacy for low-income families. I stood at the front of the church and said things about my daughter that were true. That she had learned to read at 4 years old by following the captions on the evening news. That she had once spent an entire Saturday helping me rewire the circuit panel at our restaurant because she wanted to understand how electricity moved through a building. That she asked better questions than anyone I had ever known, and that a room was always different after she left it. Diane stood beside me in a black dress and did not cry. Not once. I had told myself that was because Diane had always been the composed one, the practical one, the woman who handled difficulty by moving through it, rather than stopping to feel it. I had believed that for 5 years. What I remembered now, sitting on these front steps with Clara's note pressed against my chest, was something I had filed away without knowing I was filing it. At the end of the service, after the final prayer, when the funeral director had gently indicated that it was time, I had looked up from Clara's photograph on the altar and seen Diane and Mark standing together near the front door. Mark had his hand on Diane's elbow, and they had exchanged a look. Not a look of grief shared between 2 people who were both suffering. Something else. Something quick and deliberate that ended the moment they realized I was watching. I had told myself it was nothing. 2 people steadying each other. A son-in-law supporting his mother-in-law in a moment of loss. I pressed the heels of both hands against my eyes until I saw white. After the service, I closed the restaurant. It did not feel right to keep it open. Clara had grown up in that building, had done her homework at the corner table, had learned to count change at the register before she was 10 years old. Walking through it without her felt like walking through a place that had been gutted of everything that made it worth entering. So I locked the door and kept the key on my chain because throwing it away felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of cold coffee and empty mornings and a marriage that had become 2 people orbiting the same house without ever touching. 5 years of my hands shaking slightly when I reached for things of my thoughts, moving through what felt like standing water of days that blurred at the edges, until I could not always account for where the time had gone. 5 years of telling myself this was grief, this was aging, this was simply what happened to a man who had lost too much in too short a time. I stood up from the front steps. The hard drive was in my left hand. My truck keys were on the hook inside the door. The restaurant key had been on my chain for 5 years. I had never once asked myself why I kept it. I understood now that some part of me had always known, in the way that a man who has worked with electricity his whole life knows when a current is still running through a line that looks dead, that the story was not finished. I went inside, took my jacket from the hook by the door, and walked past the kitchen without touching the coffee Diane had left in the pot that morning. I did not want anything she had made for me. Not anymore. The drive took 11 minutes. I knew because I had made it 10,000 times before, from the house on Hillside Avenue, down through the back streets of Queens to the corner of Merrick Boulevard, where our restaurant had stood for 22 years. My hands found the turns without being told. Left on Jamaica Avenue, right on 168th Street, past the laundromat that had changed owners 3 times, and the barber shop that never had. Muscle memory is a strange thing. The body keeps maps the mind has long since stopped consulting. I pulled to the curb across the street and sat with the engine running. Hensley's Family Kitchen. The sign was still there, though the paint had faded from red to the color of old brick, and the H had tilted slightly to the left sometime in the last 2 years. The front windows were dark. A strip of masking tape ran across the door handle, where I had sealed it the week after Clara's funeral, a temporary measure I had never gone back to undo. The sidewalk in front was clean. Someone, probably old Mr. Petrakis from the dry cleaner 2 doors down, had been sweeping the leaves away from the entrance. People in this neighborhood looked after things. That was something I had always loved about it. I crossed the street, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Closed spaces hold on to the past in a way that open ones cannot. Beneath 5 years of dust and stillness, the restaurant still smelled faintly of the garlic and oregano that had soaked into the walls over 2 decades of cooking, and underneath that, something sweeter that I could not name but recognized immediately as the smell of a place where people had been happy. I stood in the doorway for a moment, with my hand on the light switch, before remembering that I had turned off the main breaker when I closed the place. The power was still live to the emergency circuit that I had wired it that way deliberately, a separate line running off a secondary panel behind the prep counter, enough to run 2 outlets and the interior locks. I plugged Clara's hard drive into my laptop at the corner table, the table where she had done her homework for 12 years. The corner booth with the cracked vinyl seat she had refused to let me reupholster because she said the crack gave it character. The drive prompted for a password. I stared at the cursor for a moment. Then I typed the date Hensley's Family Kitchen had opened for the first time. September 14th, 1991. The day Clara had stood on a step stool behind the counter, she was barely 2 years old, more in the way than anything else. Her small hands wrapped around a spoon she refused to put down, while I handed the very first customer, Mrs. Dominguez from across the street, a cup of coffee and tried not to let her see that my own hands were shaking. The drive unlocked. The folder structure was organized with a precision that was entirely Clara's. Labeled sections numbered files, a document at the top called Read This First, with instructions in her handwriting or font, the same looping letters from the note this morning. I moved my cursor toward it and then stopped because the first file in the main directory had loaded its preview, and it was a medical document with my name at the top. And the words in the summary field stopped my breath cold. Accumulated sedative compounds, consistent with prolonged low-dose oral ingestion. Patient likely unaware of exposure. I read it 3 times. The room around me did not change the dusty tables, the tilted sign visible through the front window, the particular afternoon light coming through the glass in long gold rectangles across the floor. But something inside it shifted the way a foundation shifts, not visible on the surface, but felt in the walls, in the bones of the building. Prolonged low-dose oral ingestion. Someone had been putting something into food or drink I consumed regularly, in amounts small enough that no single dose would register as unusual, but consistent enough over months and years to accumulate in my bloodstream and produce exactly the symptoms I had been experiencing. The slow thoughts, the trembling hands, the mornings when my own name felt like a word I had to locate rather than one I simply knew. I pushed back from the table and pressed both fists against my thighs and breathed through my nose the way I used to teach apprentices to breathe when they were working near a live panel and their hands were shaking. Slow and deliberate. In through the nose, out through the mouth. You do not touch a live wire when your hands are shaking. Every morning for 5 years, Diane had made the coffee. I had thanked her for it. I had wrapped both hands around the mug she placed in front of me and thought on the mornings when I felt lowest that at least she still did this one small thing. At least there was this. A cup of coffee on the kitchen table. evidence that I was still worth the effort of a small kindness. My throat closed so completely that I had to stand up from the table and walk to the window and stand there with my forehead nearly touching the glass, looking out at Merrick Boulevard in the October afternoon, at the ordinary people walking past on the sidewalk, outside at a world that had no idea what I had just read. I had not been getting older. I had not been grieving myself into confusion. I had been slowly, carefully, deliberately poisoned by the woman I had shared a bed with for 31 years. And I had thanked her for the coffee every single morning. I went back to the table. I sat down. I moved my cursor to the folder below the medical file. It was labeled with 2 names and 1 word. Diane. Mark. Everything. My finger hovered over the trackpad. Outside on the boulevard, a bus hissed to a stop. A child on the sidewalk laughed at something high and bright and completely free, the way children laugh when the world has not yet shown them what it is capable of. I clicked the folder open. The first thing in this folder was a video file. The thumbnail showed a woman sitting in front of a plain white wall, her dark hair cut short in a way I did not recognize, her hands folded on a table in front of her. She was looking directly into the camera with an expression I knew better than I knew my own face in the mirror. That particular forward stillness, chin-level eyes steady the expression Clara wore when she had something important to say and needed to make sure it landed exactly right. I pressed play. My daughter's voice came through the laptop speakers, and I grabbed the edge of the table with both hands because my body did not know what else to do with what it was hearing. Dad. Just that first. 1 word. The way she always started when she called me at the restaurant, when she wanted to make sure I was paying attention before she said the rest. If you're watching this, then Frankie did his job and you made it to our table. I need you to stay with me. All of it is true. All of it is going to make sense by the time I'm finished. She took a breath. On the screen, her jaw tightened slightly, the same way mine does when I am holding something together by force of will. 6 years ago, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Statements coming to the house addressed to you from companies I'd never heard of. 5 of them all registered within the same 3-month window. I looked them up. Hensley Capital Advisors, Realty Solutions, Whitfield Technical Consulting, 3 others. All LLCs, all with your name listed as founder and primary officer, all billing fees to a network of accounts connected to Mark's real estate operation. She paused. Dad, you didn't start those companies. I know you didn't because I found the registration documents and the signature on every single one is a forgery. I pressed my fist against my mouth. Wire fraud. Using forged signatures to create fraudulent business entities and move money through them was a federal crime under Title 18 of the United States Code, carrying up to 20 years per count. I had spent 30 years doing electrical work on commercial properties, and I knew enough about construction contracts to understand what a forged signature on a legal document meant. It meant someone had used my name, my identity, my entire working life as a vehicle for something I had never agreed to and never known about. The companies moved $2 million over 4 years, Clara continued. I've documented every transaction. The money went into real estate investments that failed on papers, but paid out to offshore accounts that Mark controls. She held up a document toward the camera. This is the insurance policy, Dad. Your life insurance. 4 years ago, someone filed a change of beneficiary form with the provider using your signature. The beneficiary was changed from me to Mark. The policy value is $800,000. The room tilted. I pressed both palms flat on the table to steady myself. Under New York law, filing a fraudulent insurance document was a Class C felony carrying up to 15 years in state prison on top of any federal charges. Diane and Mark had not simply been stealing from my retirement accounts. They had been building toward a moment when I would die and every dollar I had ever saved or insured would pass directly to the man sleeping in my daughter's bed. There's more. Clara's voice dropped lower. 8 months ago, a deed transfer was filed with the Queens County Clerk's office. The restaurant property, Dad, our building on Merrick Boulevard, it was sold to a development company called Horizon Urban Partners for $3.2 million. The seller's signature on the deed is yours. She looked directly into the camera. You didn't sell it. I pulled the closing documents. You were never present at the title company. The notary seal belongs to a firm that Mark has used on 3 other fraudulent transactions in the past 2 years. Deed fraud in New York is a Class C felony. The contract closes in 90 days. I stood up from the table so fast the chair scraped back across the tile floor. I walked to the window. I walked back. I sat down again because standing accomplished nothing, and my left knee was shaking badly enough that I did not trust it. 90 days. The building I was sitting in. The building where Clara had learned to count change and my wife, my first wife, the woman I had actually loved, had spent 20 years feeding the neighborhood, was under a fraudulent sale contract that would close before the end of January. The last thing. Clara's voice on the screen was very quiet now, the quietness of someone delivering the worst item on a list that was already devastating. 4 months ago, Mark retained a private psychiatric consultant named Dr. Harlan Webb. Webb filed an evaluation with the Queens County Surrogates Court, describing you as exhibiting early-stage cognitive decline and diminished capacity for financial decision-making. Based on that evaluation, a judge signed an emergency temporary guardianship order. She held the document up. It's already active, Dad. If anyone with that order finds you tonight, they have the legal authority to place you in a supervised care facility without a hearing, without your consent, and without a trial. Diane filed it. She is listed as your legal guardian. Clara lowered the document. For the first time in the video, something moved across her face that was not composure. Her chin trembled once briefly before she pulled it back. You have maybe 90 days before that land contract closes. Tonight matters, Dad. Go to the corner of Merrick and 168th at 1 in the morning. I'll find you. A breath. I love you. I'm sorry it took this long. The video ended. The laptop screen went dark with the auto timeout, and the restaurant fell into the particular thick quiet of a closed place at the end of an October afternoon, and I sat at the corner table where my daughter had done her homework, and I pressed both hands over my face and breathed. My phone lit up on the table beside the laptop. The screen read, Diane home. The phone buzzed 3 times before I picked it up. Those 3 seconds were the longest I had spent inside my own head in 63 years of living. I sat at the corner table in the dark restaurant, with Clara's video still open on the laptop screen, and my daughter's last words still moving through me, like a current through old wiring, and I looked at Diane's name on the phone and made a decision that I had never made in 31 years of marriage. I decided to lie. Not the small domestic lies of a long marriage. I already ate the check cleared, I don't remember saying that. Something deliberate. Something constructed. The kind of lie that requires you to take everything you are feeling and compress it down into a space so small it cannot be detected, and then open your mouth and speak from somewhere above it, somewhere calm and ordinary and completely false. I picked up the phone. Hey. My voice came out level. I was proud of that and ashamed of being proud of it. Arthur. Diane's voice was warm. That was the first thing I noticed, and the thing that turned my stomach hardest, how warm she sounded. Concerned and gentle and slightly tired in the way of a woman who had been thinking about her husband all day and was relieved to finally hear his voice. I've been calling the house. Where are you? Drove around a little, I said. Needed some air. You know how I get in the afternoons? A brief pause. Half a second, no more. Of course, are you feeling all right? You seemed a little off this morning. I seemed a little off. I had seemed a little off every morning for 5 years, because she had been putting something into my coffee every morning for 5 years, and now she was asking about my health with the voice of a devoted wife. And I was sitting in our closed restaurant, holding a hard drive that documented every crime she had committed against me, and I had to keep my voice level. I'm fine, I said. Just tired. Did you pick anything up from the mail today? The question came lightly, conversationally, the tone of a woman making idle talk. But I had just spent 40 minutes watching my daughter dismantle the last 6 years of my life, piece by piece, and I recognized the weight underneath the lightness. She was not asking about the mail. She was asking about the package. Just the usual, I said. Couple of circulars, nothing interesting. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Good. She exhaled a small sound of relief that she might have thought was inaudible. Listen, I was thinking, why don't you head home? I'll make dinner. Something warm. You sound tired, sweetheart. Sweetheart. The word landed on me like a hand on a burn. That sounds good, I said. I'll be home in a bit. Take your time. Drive safe. A beat. I love you, Arthur. I had said those words back to her on reflex for 31 years. They came automatically, the way breathing came automatically, the way reaching for her coffee mug on the kitchen table came automatically every morning without thinking about what was in it. You too, I said, and ended the call. I set the phone face down on the table and pressed both hands flat on either side of it and stared at the wood grain of the tabletop and breathed. The table was old pine worn smooth at the edges from 20 years of plates and elbows and Clara's school textbooks. I knew every scratch on its surface. I had refinished it twice. There was a burn mark near the left corner from the night a candle tipped over during the power outage of 2011, and Clara had smothered it with her jacket before it could spread, and then laughed about it afterward until she cried. I knew this table better than I knew the woman I had just spoken to. I stood up and moved to the front window, staying to the side of the glass, keeping myself out of the direct line of sight from the street. Merrick Boulevard, in the early evening, was ordinary and unhurried. A woman pushing a stroller, 2 teenagers on bikes, the lights of the dry cleaner 2 doors down still burning. Nothing that looked like a police cruiser. Not yet. But Diane had asked about the mail. She had asked where I was. She had suggested I come home with the particular gentle insistence of someone who needed to know exactly where I was and could not afford for me to be somewhere she could not see me. She had not called because she missed me. She had called because she was running inventory. I picked up the laptop and the hard drive and tucked them under my arm. The restaurant key went back into my jacket pocket. I crossed to the rear of the building through the kitchen past the prep counter and the cold walk-in and the back door that opened onto the narrow service alley behind the building. I cracked the door open 2 inches and looked out. The alley was empty. Somewhere on the boulevard a car slowed and its headlights swept briefly across the alley entrance, blue-white and searching. Not a regular car. Crown Victoria. Dark blue. My chest went tight. I eased the back door shut without letting the latch click and stood in the dark kitchen with my back against the wall, my heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. Then came the sound from the rear of the building. Not from the alley. From the side entrance on 168th Street. Heavy and deliberate. The sound of someone trying a locked door with the patience of a person who fully expected to get through it. I did not stop to think. Thinking was a luxury for men who had more time than I did. The laptop went under my left arm. The hard drive went into my inside jacket pocket against my chest, next to Clara's note. I moved through the dark kitchen from memory, 12 steps to the prep counter left around the cold walk-in, 4 steps to the utility shelf along the back wall. My hands found the shelf bracket in the dark, and I counted down 3 brackets from the left, the way I had counted them, the day I installed this panel, the day I decided that every building I wired would have a secondary control point that only I knew about. The secondary breaker box was behind a false panel, a 12 by 12 square of drywall fitted flush to the studs and painted to match the wall. I had done that myself too. In 22 years of running this restaurant, Diane had never once come into the utility area. She handled the books and the suppliers and the front of house. The back of house was mine. That division of labor, which had once seemed like a reasonable arrangement between 2 people who each had their strengths, had turned out to be the one decision that was going to save my life tonight. I pressed the panel. It swung inward on the magnetic catch I had fitted into the frame. My fingers found the secondary breaker, a single toggle manual mechanical requiring nothing but the pressure of a thumb, and I flipped it. The restaurant went dark. Not gradually. All at once, the way a switch works, because that is what it was. I heard the man at the side door say something sharp and profane, the words muffled through the wall, but the tone unmistakable. I did not wait to hear the rest of it. I was already moving back through the kitchen and I feel the left hand patrolling in the prep counter and right hand out in front of me, and I hit the back door with my shoulder and pushed through into the service alley. The October air was cold enough to sting. I moved left along the alley wall, keeping low, staying in the shadow of the building, my left knee sending up a complaint with every step that I noted and ignored. At the end of the alley, the wooden fence that divided the restaurant service area from the property behind it stood 6 feet tall. I had built that fence in 2007 with lumber from the Home Depot on Atlantic Avenue and a borrowed post hole digger. I went over it. It was not graceful. My jacket caught on the top rail, and I came down hard on both feet in the narrow side yard of the house on the other side, and the impact went straight up through my left knee, and I bit down on the sound that tried to come out of my throat and pressed my back against the fence and breathed. Across the side yard, the back porch of the house was lit by a single yellow bulb. A woman stood at the screen door in a heavy cardigan, her white hair pulled back, her arms folded across her chest. She was 71 years old, and she had lived in this house for 34 years, and she was looking directly at me with an expression that was not surprise. Ruth Cassidy had never once in 15 years of being my neighbor looked surprised by anything. Arthur Hensley. She said, her voice low and carrying the particular dryness of a woman who had been expecting exactly this. Get off my fence and come inside before you pull something. Ruth. I pushed off the fence and crossed the yard in 6 steps. There are men in my restaurant. I know. She held the screen door open. I've been watching your building for the past 3 hours. Come in. Keep your head down. Coming through the door, my kitchen light is visible from the alley. I ducked through the doorway into Ruth's kitchen. It smelled like coffee and something baking warm and ordinary in a way that hit me harder than I expected after the last 2 hours. Ruth let the screen door close behind me without a sound and moved immediately to the kitchen window, staying to the side of the glass, the same way I had stayed to the side of the restaurant window 20 minutes ago. She had done this before, or she had thought carefully about how to do it. Either way, it did not look like the first time. Ruth, I said, how do you know about— Sit down, Arthur. She was already moving toward the hallway. There's someone here who can explain it better than I can. The man sitting at Ruth's kitchen table was perhaps 35 years old, lean and straight-backed, with close-cropped dark hair, and the particular quality of stillness that I associated with people who had been trained to be calm in rooms where other people were not. He had a laptop open in front of him and a federal badge clipped to his belt, and he looked at me across Ruth's kitchen table with eyes that were unmistakably his mother's. "Mr. Hensley." He stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief. "Daniel Cassidy. I'm a special agent with the FBI's New York field office." A beat. "I've been investigating Mark Calloway for 18 months, and I have been waiting a long time to sit across from you." I took the chair across from him. My knee was throbbing. My chest was doing something complicated that I did not have the vocabulary for. I looked at this young agent with his mother's eyes and his federal badge and his laptop full of things he knew about the man who had destroyed my life, and I said the only thing I could think of to say. "My daughter," I said. "Clara. Do you know where she is?" Daniel Cassidy reached into the folder beside his laptop and placed a photograph on the table between us. A woman at a coffee shop counter, dark hair cut short, caught in three-quarter profile by what was clearly a surveillance camera. Alive. Unmistakably, completely, heartbreakingly alive. "She contacted me 6 months ago," he said. "She brought us everything." Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He read the screen. Something moved behind his eyes, a tightening, controlled, and professional, but visible if you were looking for it. "They have Frankie Ruiz," he said. "Mark just made contact. He wants the drive delivered to the restaurant by 2 in the morning." He looked at me directly. "Or he says Frankie doesn't go home." Ruth set a mug of coffee on the table in front of me, and I almost pushed it away before I caught myself. Old habits. 31 years of reaching for whatever was put in front of me without asking questions. I looked at the mug for a moment, then wrapped both hands around it and drank. Ruth Cassidy had been making coffee in this kitchen for 34 years, and not one thing she had ever handed me across a fence line had been anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. I was going to have to relearn the difference between people I could trust and people I had simply trusted out of proximity and routine. Ruth was the former. I understood that now with a clarity that felt like something breaking loose inside my chest. "Tell me about Mark Calloway," I said to Daniel. Daniel turned his laptop so I could see the screen. It showed a financial network diagram, the kind that federal investigators use to map money movement boxes, connected by lines, account numbers, shell, company names, arrows indicating the direction of transfers. In the center of the diagram, connected to everything else by a dozen different lines, was a single name: Mark Calloway. "We opened a preliminary investigation into Calloway 22 months ago," Daniel said. "Not because of you, not because of Clara, because of a real estate development deal in the Bronx that went sideways in ways that our financial crimes unit found interesting." He tapped the screen. Calloway had a pattern. He would identify undervalued properties in neighborhoods flagged for city redevelopment, acquire them through a network of LLCs, then sell them to development companies at significant markups. Clean on the surface. The problem was the source of acquisition funds. "The shell companies," I said. Daniel nodded. He needed clean money to buy the properties, money that couldn't be traced back to the fraud that generated it. That's where the LLCs registered to your name came in. Your identity gave the companies a legitimate face, a retired electrician with a clean record and a long work history. No red flags. If anyone looked at the paperwork, they saw Arthur Hensley, and they moved on. He paused. We didn't know whose name he was using until Clara walked into our field office on a Tuesday morning in April with a hard drive and a 4-inch binder and sat down across from me and spent 3 hours explaining what she had found. I pressed my thumb and forefinger against the bridge of my nose and breathed. "She came to you in April. 6 months ago, yes." Daniel's voice was careful. He was watching me the way people watch someone when they are uncertain how much weight the person can bear. She had been building the case for 4 years before that. She told me she couldn't come to us until she had enough to make it impossible to dismiss. One piece of evidence, she said, could be explained away. She needed the whole picture. 4 years. My daughter had spent 4 years living under a false name in a city that was not her home, building a legal case against her own mother and her own husband for me. I picked up the coffee mug and drank from it and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing I could say that would be adequate to that fact. Ruth sat down at the far end of the table, her hands wrapped around her own mug, watching me with the unhurried attention of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that some moments needed to be sat with rather than filled. "The wiretap," I said. "You've been listening to Mark's calls. We obtained a federal wiretap authorization from a judge in the Southern District 8 months ago," Daniel said. "Title III authorization, court approved, documented every recording legally admissible. When Calloway called the man who broke into your restaurant tonight, we heard it. When he called his associate about Frankie Ruiz 40 minutes ago, we heard that too." He turned the laptop back toward himself. "We know exactly where Frankie is being held. We have units 2 blocks out. Why haven't you gone in?" "Because Frankie is not the primary objective." Daniel met my eyes directly. "Arthur, we have 18 months of financial evidence against Calloway. What we do not yet have is Calloway and your wife in the same room on record confirming the conspiracy together. Tonight, if it goes the way Clara has planned it, we get that. Clara has planned it." I turned that phrase over in my mind. My daughter, who had spent 5 years building this from nothing, had also planned the ending. Of course she had. She had always been the one who thought 3 steps ahead. She had gotten that from her mother, my first wife, the woman I had loved before Diane, before all of this. Clara had gotten the best of that woman and brought it to bear on the worst situation I had ever found myself in. "There's one more thing," Daniel said. He reached into the folder beside his laptop and placed a photograph on the table. "This was taken 3 weeks ago. Brooklyn. A coffee shop on Flatbush Avenue." He slid it across to me. "Our surveillance team picked her up when she came in to meet with a colleague from the U.S. Attorney's Office." I picked up the photograph. Clara was standing at a counter, her profile to the camera, her dark hair short, the way it had been in the video, wearing a green jacket I had never seen before. She was saying something to the person behind the counter, and there was the beginning of a smile on her face, the left corner first smile she had inherited from me, the one I had not seen in 5 years. My throat closed so completely that I had to set the photograph back on the table and press both fists against my sternum and breathe through my nose in long, deliberate pulls. "She looks good," I managed. The words came out wrecked, and I did not care. "She does," Ruth said from the end of the table, her voice gentle. "She looks like her father." Daniel's phone lit up on the table. He read the screen and his jaw tightened by a fraction, the same controlled tell I had noticed when he read Mark's message about Frankie. He looked up at me. "Clara just made contact through our secure channel," he said. "She's 3 blocks from the restaurant. She's asking if you're safe." He paused. "And she's asking if you're ready." Daniel stepped outside to make his calls, and the kitchen settled into the kind of quiet that has texture to it. The quiet of a house that has held a lot of living within its walls and absorbed most of it into the woodwork. Ruth refilled my mug without asking. She sat back down at the far end of the table and did not say anything, which was the right thing to do because I was not yet in a place where words from another person would have helped. I was in the place that comes just before words, the place where you are still assembling the basic facts of a situation into something your body can tolerate. My daughter was alive. She was 3 blocks away. She had been alive for 5 years, while I had been standing at a cemetery marker with her name on it and talking to a piece of granite about how much I missed her voice. I pressed the heels of both hands hard against the table edge and held on. Clara Marie Hensley had been 26 years old when she disappeared. She had been working at a nonprofit on Jamaica Avenue that provided free financial counseling to families in foreclosure, because she had spent enough time watching me balance the restaurant's books on a legal pad at the kitchen table to understand that most financial disasters happened to people who simply did not have anyone explaining the system to them. She drove a 10-year-old Honda that needed new brake pads. She called me every Sunday evening at 8 o'clock without fail, and our conversations always started the same way, her asking what I had cooked that week, and me lying about how much vegetables were involved. She had been learning to rewire electrical panels from the age of 12. Not because I pushed her toward it, but because she followed me to every job site she was allowed on, and asked questions until I ran out of answers. By the time she was 16, she could read a circuit diagram faster than most of the apprentices I had trained. I used to joke that she was going to put me out of business. After her mother passed when Clara was 19, she had come home from college for the summer and spent 3 months helping me keep the restaurant running. Not because I asked, because she showed up at 6 in the morning on the first day of June with 2 bags of groceries and said, "You're not doing this alone, Dad. Move over." I had moved over. I had been so grateful I could not speak, and I had covered it by pretending to be annoyed about the way she reorganized the prep station. That was Clara. She solved problems by showing up. She fixed things by staying. She used to come over and borrow my garden shears, Ruth said from the end of the table. Her voice was quiet, remembering. Every spring. She'd do my front walk first, then yours. Never asked, never mentioned it. I'd just look out in the morning and the hedges would be done. A pause. I knew something was wrong the spring after she was gone. The hedges just sat there. I looked at Ruth across the table and felt something crack open behind my sternum that had nothing to do with anger or grief, but was instead some enormous and formless gratitude for the particular kind of person who notices the hedges and understands what they mean. "She came to Daniel 6 months ago," I said. It was not a question. I was saying it out loud to make it real. "She came to me first," Ruth said. 2 years ago. She knocked on my back door at 11 at night, which is not something a dead woman is supposed to do. The corner of her mouth moved. I made her tea. She told me enough that I called Daniel the next morning. He already had Mark Calloway in his sights for the Bronx properties. When I described what Clara had told me, he said, and I am quoting directly, Ruth looked at me over the rim of her mug. He said, "Mom, do not let that woman out of your sight until I get there." A sound came out of me that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but lived somewhere in the narrow territory between them. Ruth watched me with steady eyes and let it run its course without trying to smooth it over, which was the most respectful thing anyone had done for me in as long as I could remember. "She watched you," Ruth said after a moment. "From the street sometimes. From my upstairs window when she was here. She watched you go in and out of that house every day, and she knew what was happening to you, and she could not come to you, because if she did, before they had enough, everything she had built would disappear overnight." Ruth set her mug down. "She told me once that the worst part was your birthday. March 10th. She said she drove past the house 3 times and went home and did not sleep. March 10th. I had spent my last 3 birthdays sitting at the kitchen table while Diane made a dinner I could not taste and Mark made a toast I could not hear without wanting to leave the room. I had thought I was depressed. I had thought I was medicated by grief. I had been medicated by something else entirely, and my daughter had been driving past my house on my birthday and going home alone because she loved me enough to wait. "Is she all right?" My voice came out lower than I intended. "All this time? Is she actually all right?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. The honest pause of a person who takes the question seriously enough not to answer it quickly. "She's tired," Ruth said. "The way people get tired when they have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and they are almost at the place where they can set it down." She looked at me directly. "But she's going to be all right, Arthur. She just needs tonight to be over." The back door opened, and Daniel stepped in from the porch, his phone in his hand, and his jacket collar turned up against the October cold. He looked at me across the kitchen with his mother's eyes and said in the level voice of a man delivering operational information, "Clara wants to see you before 1 a.m. She says she needs 5 minutes, alone." I stood up from Ruth's kitchen table. My knee complained. I ignored it. "Then let's not make her wait," I said. The 3 blocks between Ruth's house and the corner of Merrick and 168th Street took me 7 minutes to walk. I know because I counted my steps the way I used to count steps when I was running wire through a long conduit in the dark, using the rhythm of my own movement as a measuring tool when I could not see the end of the line. It was the only thing that kept my hands from shaking badly enough to be visible. Left foot, right foot count. The October pavement was wet from an earlier rain, and the streetlights threw long orange reflections across the blacktop, and the ginkgo trees along the curb had dropped most of their leaves, leaving the branches bare and black against the sky. Queens at 1 in the morning was not empty. A delivery truck idled outside a grocery on the next block. 2 men in work jackets stood talking outside a bodega with their breath coming out in white clouds. A car with a broken taillight moved slowly down the boulevard. The ordinary middle-of-the-night machinery of a city that never completely stopped, indifferent to the fact that a 63-year-old man was walking through it toward the most important corner of his life. I reached Merrick and 168th and stopped on the near sidewalk. The intersection was quiet. The restaurant was dark half a block up on my left, its tilted sign barely visible. Directly across the street, a single streetlight burned at the corner, throwing a circle of amber light down onto the wet pavement. Beneath it, standing with her back to me, was a woman in a dark jacket. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair was short, the way it had been in the video, and in the surveillance photograph, cut close at the back of her neck, in a way that made her look both younger and older than the daughter I had been carrying in my memory for 5 years. She had her hands in her jacket pockets, and her shoulders were pulled up slightly against the cold, and there was something in the particular set of her spine, the way she held herself, that I would have recognized at 1,000 yards in total darkness, because I had watched that spine straighten up 10,000 times over 26 years, whenever Clara was preparing herself for something difficult. She turned around. The amber light caught her face and my body stopped working correctly. My legs locked. My chest seized so hard that I pressed my right fist against my sternum and pushed as though I could manually restart whatever had just stopped inside me. 5 years had changed the lines around her eyes and sharpened her jaw, and there were things in her face now that had not been there before, things that accumulate in a person when they have been living under a weight that no 26-year-old should have to carry. But her eyes were the same. Dark and direct, and completely steady, looking at me the way she had always looked at me since she was small, like I was the fixed point she used to orient everything else. I stepped off the curb. She shook her head. One small, urgent movement. Her eyes went wide and then deliberately calm, sending a message as clearly as if she had shouted it across the intersection. Not yet. Not safe. Stay. Everything in my body argued with that message. My legs wanted to cross that street with a desperation I had not felt since the night I ran 3 blocks to the restaurant, because Clara had called saying the gas line was making a sound she did not recognize, and she was alone. My arms wanted to cover the distance between us and close around my daughter, and not let go until something in the universe acknowledged that this was wrong. that 5 years was too long, that no father should have to stand on a wet street corner at 1 in the morning and not run to his own child. I stayed on my side of the street. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, and it was not close. Clara held my gaze for 4 seconds. I counted those too. Then she took 1 step backward toward the shadow of the building behind her and raised her right hand to the level of her shoulder palm, out fingers spread. In the electrical trade, that gesture meant stop, do not touch live current. She had learned it from me when she was 12 years old. She stepped back into the shadow, and she was gone. I stood on the corner of Merrick and 168th, with my fist still pressed against my sternum and my eyes burning so badly that the streetlight across the road split into 3, and I had to drag the back of my hand across my face before I could see clearly again. My breath came out in ragged pulls that turned white in the October air and dissolved. She was alive. She was 3 feet taller than the grief I had been carrying, and she had looked at me with those steady eyes, and she was alive. My jacket pocket vibrated. A number I did not recognize. I answered it because tonight every unknown number was something I needed to hear. "Hello, Arthur?" The voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never in his life been on the losing side of a negotiation and did not expect to start tonight. "I think we have been patient with each other long enough. It is time to finish this." Mark Calloway. Speaking to me directly for the first time, his voice carrying the particular easy confidence of a man who believed he controlled every variable in the room. I turned away from the corner where my daughter had just vanished. I squared my shoulders. I made my voice into something flat and cooperative, the voice of a tired old man who had run out of options. "Tell me where to go," I said. Mark Calloway did not tell me where to go immediately. That was the first thing I noticed about the way he operated. He let the silence after my question sit for 4 full seconds before he responded. Not because he needed to think about the answer, but because he wanted me to feel the weight of waiting for it. It was a negotiating technique. I had seen contractors use it across job site tables for 40 years, the deliberate pause that said, "I am not in a hurry," which meant I am the one with the leverage here, which meant you are the one who needs something from me. Mark Calloway had learned it well. "Frankie," I said, "is comfortable. Unhappy, but comfortable. He'll go home the moment I confirm the files are deleted." A pause. "Arthur, I want you to understand something. This does not have to be complicated. You give me what I need, I give you back your mailman, and by morning this is simply a bad dream that nobody needs to talk about again." I was standing on a wet corner in Queens at 1 in the morning with my daughter's handprint still burning in my memory, and the smell of Ruth Cassidy's coffee still on my jacket, and the man on the other end of this call was describing the destruction of my life as something that did not have to be complicated. "The guardianship order," I said. "Diane's name is on it. Diane's name is on a great many things." His voice did not change. Not a flicker, not a degree of warmth or cold. "That's what made her useful. But those arrangements are administrative. They can be unwound quietly. No court appearances, no public record. You have my word." His word. I pressed the phone hard against my ear to keep my hand from shaking visibly, because I was standing in an open street, and I did not know who was watching. Mark Calloway's word was a document with a forged signature. Mark Calloway's word was a psychiatric evaluation written about a man who had never exhibited a single symptom of what it described. Mark Calloway's word was 31 years of Sunday dinners and holiday tables, and a handshake at a wedding altar, and what it had purchased was $2 million out of my retirement accounts, and a sale contract on the building my daughter had grown up in. "All right," I said, "front door, 1 o'clock. Good man." The approval in his voice was genuine, which was the most nauseating thing about it. He actually felt it. The satisfaction of a man who had correctly predicted that the person on the other end of the line would fold when the pressure was applied correctly. One more thing. If I see Daniel Cassidy or anyone else with a federal badge within 2 blocks of that building, Frankie goes home in a condition that will require medical attention. Are we clear? We're clear, I said. Arthur? His voice dropped slightly, taking on a register that was almost conversational, almost warm, the voice he must have used at the dinner table all those years when I thought he was my son-in-law. I know this is hard. I know you loved Clara. Grief does things to people, makes them see patterns that aren't there, makes them reach for explanations. A breath. That drive is not what you think it is. There are people who want to take advantage of a man in your position. I am trying to protect you from that. The cold thing in my chest expanded by several degrees. He was still running the play. Even now, with Frankie Ruiz sitting in a room somewhere, and a federal agent 2 blocks away, and 5 years of documented evidence sitting in a hard drive against my ribs, Mark Calloway was still performing the role of the concerned son-in-law, trying to look after a confused old man. He had been running this play so long, it had become his only setting. He did not know how to stop. I know you will. Another pause, shorter this time. There's one more thing I need to say. The conversational warmth left his voice like a light being switched off, cleanly and completely. I know about Clara Arthur. I have known for 2 years. I want you to understand that I have been patient about that. My patience has a limit. Tonight, bring me the drive, and whatever your daughter has been planning ends here, quietly. No one else gets hurt. The line went quiet. He had not asked a question. He had stated a fact and hung up the way men do when they are certain the other person has no move left to make. I lowered the phone and stood on the corner of Merrick Boulevard with the October cold pressing against my face and the wet pavement gleaming under the streetlights and the sound of the city moving quietly around me, and I thought about what Mark Calloway had just told me without meaning to. He had said no one else gets hurt, which meant he had already decided that someone was going to get hurt. The only question in his mind was the size of the circle. I needed to see my daughter's face one more time close enough to tell her that I understood the plan and that I was not going to let her down. I walked fast. My knee screamed at me with every step, and I told it firmly that it was going to have to wait until morning. Clara was already at Ruth's kitchen table when I came through the back door. She was bent over a hand-drawn diagram on a sheet of printer paper, marking something with a pen, and she looked up when I came in, and for 1 full second neither of us moved. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much, and we both understood without discussing it that the too much was going to have to wait until the other side of tonight. She stood up. I crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her face up close for the first time in 5 years. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there before. Her jaw was sharper. She looked like a woman who had been making hard decisions in difficult rooms for a long time and had gotten very good at it. She looked like her mother, the first one, the one I had loved, and she looked like me, and she looked like nobody else on earth. "You're too thin," I said. It was not what I meant to say. It was the first true thing that came out of my mouth. Clara made a sound that was half laugh and half something raw. "You're too gray," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard and pulled it back. She gripped my forearms with both hands, tight enough that I felt her fingers through my jacket sleeve. "Later, Dad." "Okay, all of it. Later." "Later," I agreed. She let go and turned back to the diagram. I sat down across from her and made myself focus because Clara needed me functional right now, and falling apart was a luxury I could not afford for another 40 minutes. Joey Ruiz was standing near the kitchen doorway, with his arms folded and the tight, controlled expression of a 24-year-old who was holding himself together by concentrating very hard on being useful. He had his father's build and his father's eyes, and he was looking at me with a mixture of guilt and determination that I recognized as the face of a young man who believed he owed somebody something and intended to pay it. "Mr. Hensley," he said, "I'm Joey, Frankie's son. I'm the one who took the package from Clara 3 months ago." He swallowed. I should have told my dad sooner what it was. He wouldn't be in that room right now if I had. "Your father is in that room because Mark Calloway put him there," I said. "Not because of anything you did. Are we clear on that?" Joey nodded once tight. Something in his shoulders dropped by a fraction. Daniel spread a second diagram on the table beside Clara's. It was a floor plan printed and annotated in pencil with entry points marked and positions noted in Daniel's precise handwriting. "We have 4 agents on the perimeter," he said. 2 on Merrick, 1 on 168th, 1 covering the service alley. They will not move until they receive my signal. He looked at me. "The signal is the interior lights going out." "The secondary breaker," I said. "Correct. The moment the lights drop, my team enters through the service door on the east side of the building. Clara enters with them." He glanced at Clara. "She insisted on that point, and I have stopped arguing about it." 40 minutes of arguing," Clara said without looking up from her diagram. "He lost." I looked at the floor plan. The restaurant layout was in my hands, and my memory, the way all buildings I had wired were in my memory, not as an abstract drawing, but as a physical experience, the actual weight of the conduit, and the smell of the drywall, and the specific sound each room made when you moved through it. I had spent 3 days in that building in the fall of 2015, upgrading the panel, and adding the secondary breaker, and installing the concealed control point in the utility wall. I had done it carefully, and I had done it alone, and I had never told Diane it existed, because there was no reason to tell her at the time. There was a reason now. "The breaker cuts everything on the main circuit simultaneously," I said. "Lights the electronic door locks on the front entrance, the alarm panel. Everything." I pointed to the east wall on the diagram. "The service door runs on a separate mechanical lock. Key operated. It will not be affected." "We have the key," Daniel said. "Clara obtained a copy 2 months ago." I looked at my daughter. She had obtained a copy of the service door key to our closed restaurant 2 months ago as part of a plan she had been building toward for 5 years. She was still bent over her diagram, making a small correction with her pen, her handwriting as careful and precise as it had always been. "The drive," Clara said, looking up. "You need to walk in with it. Let Mark verify it. Let him believe he has everything he needs. The moment he relaxes his attention on Frankie is the moment you move to the breaker." She paused. "Can you find it in the dark?" "I installed it," I said. "I can find it blindfolded." "Then that is exactly what you are going to do." She slid her diagram across the table. She had marked the utility wall with a small X and drawn a dotted line from the front counter to that point. 12 steps left turn 4 steps. The route I had run from memory in the dark 2 hours ago. "The moment the lights go out, get away from the center of the room. Move to the east wall and stay there. We come in within 30 seconds. 30 seconds in a dark room with Mark Calloway and whatever men he had brought with him was a very long time. I did not say that. Clara knew it already. She had the face of someone who had thought about it many times and made her peace with the number. Ruth appeared at the kitchen doorway with a travel mug and held it out to me. "Coffee," she said. "Real coffee. Mine." I took it. I drank. It was very good. Daniel checked his watch. "We need to move in 15 minutes. He looked at me directly. "Arthur?" Once you walk through that front door, we cannot pull you out. If something goes wrong before the lights drop, you are on your own until my team breaches the service entrance. A beat. Are you sure? I thought about the corner of Merrick and 168th and the amber streetlight, and Clara's hand raised in the signal that meant live current, do not touch. I thought about 5 years of cold coffee and shaking hands, and a marriage that had been quietly poisoning me from the inside out. I thought about a building on Merrick Boulevard that I had wired with my own hands 10 years ago, that I knew better than anyone alive that was waiting for me to come back and finish what I started. I've been pulling live wire since I was 22 years old, I said. I know how to handle the current. Daniel nodded. Clara capped her pen and folded her diagram and put it in her jacket pocket. Joey straightened up from the doorway with the look of someone who had found the thing he was supposed to do and intended to do it correctly. Ruth collected the coffee mugs from the table with the brisk efficiency of a woman who expressed love through keeping her hands busy. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the back door. The front door of Hensley's family kitchen was unlocked. That was the first thing that told me how certain Mark was about tonight. A man who was uncertain locked his doors, checked his exits, kept his options open. A man who believed he had already won left the front door unlocked because he wanted you to walk through it, without friction, without delay, without anything that might give you a moment to reconsider. He wanted me inside that building the way a trap wants the thing it was built for. I pushed the door open and walked in. The restaurant had been cleaned. That was the second thing I noticed, and it landed harder than I expected. The dust covers had been pulled from the tables and stacked in the corner. The chairs had been set out on the floor. Mark's men had located the primary breaker panel behind the counter and forced the lights back on, and Hensley's family kitchen looked for the first time in 5 years like a place where people were supposed to be. It looked the way it had looked on any ordinary Tuesday evening when Clara was doing her homework in the corner booth, and something was on the stove, and the door was open for whoever needed to come in. Mark Calloway had staged my restaurant. He had made it look like home so that walking into it would feel like surrender. Diane was standing at the center of the room. 31 years. I had known this woman for 31 years. I had married her 4 years after my first wife passed when Clara was 11 years old, and I was 41. And I believed, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had already lost one thing he loved completely, that I was making a careful and reasonable decision. Diane had been capable and organized and steady in a way that felt at the time like something I could build a life around. And I had. I had built 31 years around it. She was wearing a dark blazer, and her hair was pulled back the way she wore it for important meetings, and she was looking at me with an expression I had to look at very carefully before I understood what it was. Not triumph, not guilt. Something more complicated than either something that lived in the territory between the two and had not yet resolved itself into one or the other. She looked like a woman who had made a decision a long time ago and had been living inside the consequences of it for so long that she had stopped being able to see them clearly. She looked like someone I had once known. Arthur. Her voice was steady. It had always been steady. That was the thing about Diane that I had mistaken for 3 decades for strength. Diane, I said. Mark stepped out from the kitchen doorway. He was taller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply never looked at him directly before, never stood in a room with him knowing what I knew. He was 51 years old, and he moved with the ease of a man who had spent his adult life in rooms where he controlled the terms, and he was looking at me with an expression that was almost warm, the expression of a man wrapping a transaction in the appearance of civility. Arthur. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm and brief and told me nothing except that he had done this many times before and was not nervous about doing it now. I noted the two men standing near the back wall, large and professionally blank-faced, the kind of men who were paid not to have expressions. I noted the door to the kitchen behind Mark, slightly ajar. I noted the clock on the wall above the counter. 2:03 in the morning. Frankie was sitting on a chair near the window, his postal jacket still on, his hands resting on his knees, with the careful stillness of a man who had been told exactly once to stay in that chair and stay quiet, and had believed the instruction completely. He looked at me when I came in, and something moved across his face that was not quite relief and not quite fear, but was the specific expression of a man who was very glad to see a familiar face and very uncertain about what that face being here meant for the next hour. "Frankie," I met his eyes. "You doing all right?" "Been better," Frankie said. His voice was steady, which told me more about Frankie Ruiz's character than anything I had learned about him in 18 years of receiving mail from his hands. "This is touching," Mark said pleasantly. He gestured toward the counter where a laptop sat open. "But we have business, Arthur. The drive, if you don't mind." I reached into my jacket and placed Clara's hard drive on the counter. Mark picked it up, turned it over in his hands, examined the casing. Satisfied, he set it down and turned the laptop toward me. The screen showed a cloud storage interface, multiple folders, the backup files Clara had helped me upload 2 days ago from a library computer on Jamaica Avenue. "Delete them," Mark said. "All of them. Root folder first, then the archive. I'll watch." I pulled the laptop toward me. My hands were steady. I was proud of that too, and this time I was not ashamed of it. Diane moved to my left 2 steps, positioning herself where she could see the screen. She was watching the cursor with the focused attention of a woman who had spent years managing numbers and knew exactly what she was looking at. I was aware of her beside me the way you are aware of a current running through a line you cannot see, not by sight, but by some deeper sense that had learned over decades of working with electricity to feel the charge in the air before it became visible. She had made me coffee every morning for 5 years. She had stood at the kitchen counter in her robe and poured it into my mug and handed it to me and said good morning, and I had said good morning back, and she had watched me drink it. I looked at her just for a moment, just long enough for her to see that I was looking. She met my eyes and held them, and in the space of that 2-second exchange, I saw something shift behind hers, a small and barely perceptible movement, like a wall taking a crack too fine to see from the outside but present nonetheless. She knew that I knew. She had known since the moment I walked through that door. Mark slid the laptop back in front of me. "Whenever you're ready, Arthur." I looked down at my left foot. The floor under it was old pine worn smooth in the traffic patterns of 22 years of customers moving between the door and the counter. 3 feet to my left, beneath the baseboard, behind the false panel that matched the wall so exactly that you would never know it was there unless you had put it there yourself, was a toggle switch no larger than my thumb. The clock above the counter read 2:04. I moved my left foot 6 inches toward the baseboard. Before I reveal the shocking truth and the heart-pounding showdown about to take place in total darkness, leave a comment with "still here" or the number 99 below so I know you're still right here with us. Please note, the following story contains dramatized and fictional elements that may not be entirely factual. If you prefer strictly real-life events, feel free to turn off the video right here. 6 inches. That was the distance between where my left foot had been and where it needed to go. 6 inches of worn pine flooring, smooth under the sole of my shoe, from 22 years of foot traffic, customers moving back and forth between the door and the counter and the corner booths, Clara crossing this floor 1,000 times, carrying plates and textbooks and cups of coffee. 6 inches that represented the difference between what Mark Calloway believed was happening in this room and what was actually about to happen in it. I typed nothing on the laptop. I moved my fingers across the keyboard in the pattern of someone who was complying. someone who was tired and beaten and doing what he had been told. And I watched the cursor on the screen without seeing it, because my attention was not on the screen. My attention was on the baseboard 3 feet to my left, and on the clock above the counter, and on the 2 men near the back wall, and on Frankie sitting very still near the window with his hands on his knees. "You're taking a while," Mark said from behind my left shoulder. His voice was still pleasant, still patient. The voice of a man who had not yet found a reason to stop being pleasant. "Big files," I said. "Takes a minute to clear the cache." A pause. He accepted this. Of course he did. He was watching a 63-year-old retired electrician delete the evidence that would put him in federal prison, and the 63-year-old retired electrician was doing exactly what he had been told to do, and there was no reason in Mark Calloway's operational framework for anything else to be happening. That was the thing about people who believed they controlled every variable. They stopped checking for the ones they had not accounted for. I pressed my left foot flat against the floor. The false panel was behind the baseboard at the base of the utility wall 3 feet to my left. The toggle switch inside it was mechanical, not electronic. It required nothing more than direct contact pressure applied in the right direction. I had tested it twice in the 30 years since I installed it, once the week after installation, and once on the afternoon 3 months ago, when I'd come back alone to make sure it still worked, telling Diane I was taking a drive to clear my head. It had worked both times. Mechanical switches properly installed do not fail. That is the first thing they teach you when you are learning the trade. Electronic systems fail. Mechanical systems built correctly simply wait. I shifted my weight. The sole of my left shoe made contact with the baseboard. I felt the faint give of the magnetic catch releasing the false panel, swinging inward on its hinges by a 1/4 inch, just enough. My toes found the toggle through the gap at the bottom of the panel, the way your fingers find a light switch in a dark room you have lived in long enough by memory and by the particular shape of the thing you are reaching for. I pressed down. The restaurant went dark, not gradually, not with a flicker or a warning. One instant, the overhead fluorescents were burning at full brightness, throwing their flat white light across the counter and the tables and the faces of everyone in the room. And the next instant, they were not. The darkness was complete and immediate and total, the specific quality of darkness that exists inside a building with no windows when every light source is removed simultaneously. The kind of darkness that is not peaceful. The kind that has weight. For 1 full second, nobody moved. Then Mark Calloway said sharply, and without any of the pleasantness remaining, "What did you do?" It was not a question. I was already moving. 3 steps, left hand trailing the counter edge, the surface smooth and familiar under my palm. I heard one of the men near the back wall take 2 quick steps and then stop, uncertain in the darkness, unwilling to move fast, through a space he did not know. I heard Frankie make a sharp sound and then go quiet, which told me he had enough sense to stay in his chair and stay small. I heard Diane say something low and urgent to Mark, her voice stripped of its steadiness for the first time, the particular roughness of a composed person encountering something they had not prepared for. The counter ended. I moved left 4 steps, right hand out, until my fingers touched the cold metal of the old prep shelf. The utility wall was directly in front of me. I stopped. I pressed my back against the wall and stood completely still and let the darkness work for me the way darkness works for anyone who knows a space better than the people they are sharing it with. "The breaker panel," Mark said closer now, moving toward where he thought I was. His voice had found a new register, harder and thinner. "Find the breaker panel and get the lights back on. Now!" He was talking to his men. Neither of them answered, which meant neither of them knew where the breaker panel was. Of course they did not. The main breaker panel was on the east wall behind the counter, visible labeled the kind of panel a building inspector would look for and find immediately. Mark would have found it too if he had thought to look. He had not thought to look. Why would he? The building belonged to a confused old man who no longer ran anything. What was there to find? "Your panel is on the east wall," I said from the darkness. My voice came out steady. I was not particularly proud of that this time. It simply was what it was, the voice of a man who was standing on ground he had built with his own hands. "It runs the main circuit, lights the electronic locks on the front entrance, the alarm system, everything on the primary line." A beat of silence from Mark's direction. "But I did not cut the main breaker," I said. "I cut the secondary, the one behind the false panel in the utility wall. The one I installed myself 10 years ago and never told anyone about." I paused to let that settle. The secondary breaker controls one additional system, the rolling security door on the front entrance. It is a commercial fail-safe installation. When the secondary circuit drops, the door defaults to its closed and locked position. Mechanical lock, not electronic. It cannot be opened from inside without the external key. I heard Mark move toward the front of the restaurant. I heard a moment later the sound of the rolling door against the frame, and then the harder sound of someone pushing against something that was not going to move. "You wired this building," Mark said. His voice was very controlled now. The pleasantness was completely gone, and what remained underneath it was not panic, not yet, but the particular cold quality of a very intelligent man recalculating in real time. "I wired this building," I agreed from the darkness. "Every switch, every circuit, every lock." I moved 2 steps toward the east wall away from the center of the room. "I designed the system. I installed it. I documented it." I reached the wall and put my shoulder blades against it and held still. "And 10 years ago when I was done, I left myself a way back in, standard practice, in case the owner ever needed it." 3 knocks on the service door. Firm, evenly spaced. The signal. The service door opened from the outside with a mechanical key swinging inward on hinges. I had balanced and oiled myself, and the October night came in with it cold and clean, and with it came the flat white beams of tactical flashlights, and the sound of Daniel Cassidy's voice saying clearly and without hurry, "Federal agents, nobody move." The lights came up, not the overhead fluorescents. Something smaller, portable, set up fast by people who had trained for exactly this kind of entry. The room resolved itself out of the darkness in pieces. Mark standing near the front door, with his hand still against the roll-down, his face doing something I had not seen it do before. The 2 men near the back wall with their hands already rising. Frankie still in his chair, his eyes wide, his hands pressed flat on his knees. And Diane, standing exactly where she had been standing when the lights went out in the center of the room, her arms at her sides, looking at the service door, with an expression that had passed surprise into something I did not yet have a name for. She was looking at what had come through the door behind the federal agents. I looked too. She came through the door third, Daniel first badge out voice already filling the room with the flat authority of federal procedure. 2 agents behind him, tactical lights sweeping the space in efficient arcs, finding the 2 men near the back wall, finding Mark at the front door, finding Frankie in his chair. All of that happened in the first 4 seconds after the service door opened, and I registered it the way you register peripheral information when the center of your attention has become so absolute that everything else exists only at the edges. Because Clara came through the door third, and when she did, the room rearranged itself around her. She was wearing the dark jacket from the surveillance photograph, the one I had looked at on Daniel's kitchen table, and pressed my fists against my sternum to keep from falling apart. Her hair was short, and her jaw was sharp, and she moved with the particular forward economy of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time and was not going to let anything in the room slow her down. She cleared the doorway, and her eyes went immediately, before anything else, to me. I was against the east wall where I had told her I would be. Her eyes found me, and something in her face broke open and then closed again, fast, controlled, because there was still work to do, and Clara had always finished the work before she allowed herself to feel it. Then she looked at Diane. Diane had not moved from the center of the room. She was standing with her arms at her sides and her chin up, the posture she had worn through 31 years of difficult conversations, board meetings, and every moment in which she had needed the world to see her as someone who could not be shaken. I had watched her stand exactly that way at Clara's funeral service. I had thought it was composure. I understood now that it was armor, and I was watching it fail in real time, piece by piece, starting with her hands. Her hands were shaking. Diane Hensley's hands, which had been steady enough to pour sedative into a coffee mug every morning for 5 years, without spilling a drop, were shaking at her sides. Her fingers moving in small, helpless contractions, reaching for something to hold on to that was not there. "Mom." Clara said it quietly, the way you say a word, when you are not sure the person can hear you, when you are not sure the person is entirely present in the room with you. Just that one word, flat and bare and carrying everything inside it. Diane's lips parted. No sound came out. Mark turned from the front door. He had been watching Daniel's agents with the careful attention of a man who was running options, calculating distances, assessing whether there was still a move available to him. When he turned and saw Clara standing in the center of his operational picture, something happened behind his eyes that I had not seen there before. Not fear, not exactly. Something colder and more precise. The specific expression of a man watching the last variable he had been controlling disappear. For 2 years, Mark Calloway had known Clara was alive. He had used that knowledge as a mechanism of control over Diane, a lever he could apply whenever she showed signs of uncertainty, of wavering, of remembering who she had been before all of this. He had kept it in reserve, the way you keep a tool you hope you will not need to use. And now Clara was standing in this room in plain sight, and Diane could see her, and the tool was gone. He took one step toward Diane and said quietly and urgently, "Don't." Diane looked at him. The shaking in her hands moved up through her arms and into her shoulders, and she wrapped both arms around herself and held on, and her face did something that I will spend a long time trying to find adequate words for. It was not grief, though grief was inside it. It was not guilt, though that was there too. It was the expression of a woman who had built something here large on a foundation that she had known somewhere beneath every justification was wrong, and who was standing in the moment when the foundation finally gave way, and the building came down, and there was nothing left to do but stand in the rubble of it and breathe. She looked at Clara for a long moment. Clara looked back. Neither of them said anything for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, everything that had happened between them over the past 6 years moved through the air of that restaurant, like a current through a closed circuit, completing itself. Then Diane turned to Daniel Cassidy and said in a voice that was perfectly steady, the steadiness of a woman who had made the last decision she was ever going to make in this room. "I want to cooperate. I want to make a full statement. I want an attorney present, and I want it on record that I am initiating this voluntarily." Daniel looked at her for one beat, then nodded. "That's your right. We'll get you an attorney." He turned to his agents. "Read Mr. Calloway his rights." Mark said something sharp and profane. One of the agents recited the Miranda warning in the flat, practiced cadence of a person who had said these words many hundreds of times and understood that their power lay not in the delivery, but in what they meant. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. The handcuffs closed around Mark's wrists with a sound like a cabinet latch catching small and mechanical and final. He looked at me across the room. His face had reorganized itself back into something controlled, something that would photograph well and read well in a courtroom, the face of a man who had decided that this was simply the next negotiation, and he would find the angle in it the way he found the angle in everything. He did not look at Diane. He was already done with Diane. I looked back at him and said nothing because there was nothing I needed to say to Mark Calloway that the next 25 years would not say better. Frankie Ruiz stood up slowly from his chair and straightened his postal jacket and looked around the room with the expression of a man who had just lived through something he was going to be describing to people for the rest of his life. "Arthur," he said. "Frankie, next time you want me to deliver something important," he said, "maybe give me a little more context." And then Clara was in front of me, not across a street, not through a window, not in a video or a photograph or a surveillance image taken from 40 feet away. She was standing 18 inches from me in the restaurant where she had grown up, and her eyes were wet, and her chin was shaking, and she was gripping the front of my jacket with both fists, the way she had gripped my hand when she was 4 years old and frightened of thunderstorms. "Dad," she said, and her voice broke completely on the single syllable cracked straight down the middle and fell open, and I pulled my daughter into my arms and held on. I do not know how long we stood there, long enough that one of Daniel's agents moved past us twice without comment, which told me the FBI had been briefed on this particular variable and had decided correctly that it was not their jurisdiction. Long enough that Frankie Ruiz found himself a chair near the counter and sat down and looked at the wall with the philosophical patience of a man who had learned over 18 years of delivering mail in Queens that the most important thing you could do while other people were going through something was stay out of the way and be available if needed. Eventually, Clara pulled back. Not all the way. She kept one hand on my arm, her fingers wrapped around my jacket sleeve above the elbow, the grip of someone making absolutely certain that the person they were holding was not going to disappear if they loosened their hold. I understood that impulse completely. "Come sit down," she said. She led me to the corner booth. 5 years of closure had not changed it. I slid in across from her and put my elbows on the table and looked at my daughter's face in the flat white light of Daniel's tactical lamps and tried to memorize it the way you try to memorize things you have been without for too long and are terrified of losing again. "Your hands have stopped shaking," Clara said. "Yours haven't," I said. She looked down at her hands on the table. Her right hand was trembling slightly, a fine continuous movement she seemed to have stopped noticing. She pressed it flat against the table and held it there. 5 years, she said. Not an accusation, not an apology, just the number set on the table between us like something that needed to be acknowledged before anything else could happen. 5 years, I said. She took a breath. I need to tell you something that I have been practicing saying for a long time, and now that I'm here, I can't remember a single word of how I planned it. Her jaw tightened. So I'm just going to say the real version. I'd prefer the real version, I said. Clara looked at me directly. I found out about the companies 18 months before I disappeared. I found the first registration document in Mark's home office when I was looking for a pen. It had your name on it and a signature that was not yours, and I knew immediately what it was, because you taught me what your signature looks like. You made me practice it when I was 12, do you remember? You said everyone should be able to recognize a forgery of their own family's handwriting. I remembered. I had shown her my signature on a legal pad, then shown her 3 versions I had written slightly differently, and asked her to pick the original. She had been right on the first try, which had not surprised me at all. I didn't come to you immediately because I was afraid, she said. Not of Mark, of what you would do. You would have confronted him. Diane would have denied everything. The documents would have disappeared overnight, and we would have had nothing. She pressed her flat hand harder against the table. So I started building it instead, quietly, the way you build a circuit. One connection at a time, making sure each one is solid before you move to the next. When did you know about your mother? I asked. The word mother came out careful because I was not certain which word to use for Diane anymore, and I had not yet worked out a replacement. 8 months in, so, Clara said. I found the insurance document, the beneficiary change. Something moved across her face that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived between them the way most of the hardest feelings do. That was when I understood it was not just Mark. That was when I understood how long it had been going on and what the end of it was supposed to look like. She stopped. Outside the restaurant somewhere on Merrick Boulevard, a car moved slowly past. The ordinary sound of a city conducting its nighttime business, indifferent and continuous. The hardest part, Clara said, and her voice dropped to a register I had not heard before, something low and effortful, the voice of someone lifting something heavy, was not the evidence. It was not moving apartments every 4 months, so Mark's man could not pin down an address. It was not watching you from Ruth's upstairs window on Sunday mornings. She looked at me. The hardest part was your birthday, March 10th. I drove past this house 3 times. I sat outside in the car with my hands on the wheel, and I told myself that 60 more days was all I needed, that 90 days was manageable, that waiting was the right thing. Her chin shook once hard. I could not make myself drive away the 3rd time. I sat there for 40 minutes. Ruth came out and knocked on my car window and told me to come inside because I was going to attract attention. She didn't tell me, I said. I made her promise. Clara's eyes were very bright. Because I knew if she told you, you would come outside, and if you came outside, I would not be able to leave, and if I could not leave, we would lose everything we had built. She loved me enough to sit outside in the dark and not knock on the door. She loved me enough to drive away 3 times. She had spent 5 years measuring her love against the work that needed to be done, and every single time the work had won, not because she loved me less, but because she loved me with the particular fierce and operational love of a woman who intended to make things right and understood that wanting was not the same as doing. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers where it was pressed against the old pine. You did make it right, I said. Clara turned her hand over and gripped mine so hard that I felt the bones of my fingers shift, and I did not say a word about it. There's one more thing, she said, and her voice shifted back into something steadier, something that carried the residue of the last 6 years in it. About Ruth's son, about Dr. Okafor. There are people you need to meet properly, dad people who showed up for you when I couldn't, and I need you to know their names before morning. Daniel appeared at the edge of the booth. He looked at the 2 of us across the table with his mother's eyes, and something in his expression was careful and deliberate, the look of a man who knew he was interrupting something that mattered and was going to do it anyway because the work required it. Arthur, he said quietly, there's one more piece. Dr. Patricia Okafor just arrived. Dr. Patricia Okafor came through the service door the same way Clara had, without announcement, without ceremony, with the particular unhurried directness of a woman who had decided exactly what she was going to do before she arrived, and was simply doing it now. She was 58 years old, and she had been our family physician for 20 years. She had treated Clara's broken wrist when Clara was 14, and fell off a ladder she had no business being on. She had managed my blood pressure since I turned 50, and sent me away from her office with printed instructions about sodium that I had followed approximately 40% of the time, and she had known about that 40% and not said anything because she understood that a man who had spent his life working with his hands needed to feel that some decisions were still his own. 3 years ago, Diane had called her office and transferred my care to a physician closer to our house. Dr. Okafor had not argued. She had said she understood she wished me well, and she had put down the phone and gone back through every blood panel, every metabolic screen, every routine result she had in my file for the previous 18 months. She had found the numbers that did not belong. She walked toward the corner booth where Clara and I were sitting, and she was carrying a manila folder that was thick enough to suggest she had been holding on to it for a long time and had not been entirely certain she would ever get to use it. She stopped at the edge of the table, and she looked at me, and her expression was the expression of a doctor who has been carrying knowledge she could not act on, which is one of the heavier things a person can carry. "Arthur," she said. She did not say she was sorry. She said my name instead, and she said it in a way that contained the apology inside it, without making the apology the point. And that was the right thing to do, and I appreciated it more than I could have expressed. "Patricia," I said. "Sit down." She sat. She placed the folder on the table and opened it without preamble. The top sheet was a blood panel from 4 years ago, my name and date of birth, printed in the header rows of values and reference ranges in the organized columns of a standard laboratory report. "These are your results from the last 18 months I had you as a patient," she said. She ran her finger down a column on the right side of the page. "This value here, benzodiazepine metabolites. The reference range for a person not taking prescribed medication is undetectable. Your level at this visit was 0.03 milligrams per liter." She turned to the next sheet. 6 months later, 0.07. The visit after that, 0.12. She looked at me. "Each measurement on its own is low enough that a physician seeing you for the first time without the longitudinal record would likely attribute it to a legitimate prescription or a dietary supplement interaction and move on. But you had the longitudinal record," I said. "I had 20 years of your blood work," she said. "I knew what your baseline looked like. I knew you had never taken a benzodiazepine in your life." She closed the folder. "I flagged it internally. I wrote a note in your file. And then Diane transferred your care, and I could not follow up, and I could not report a suspicion without evidence of intent, and I—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened briefly. "I kept the records. I did not know what else to do with them that would not simply disappear into a process that Diane and Mark had more control over than I did." She slid the folder across the table to me. "Clara contacted me 14 months ago. She had already built most of the financial case. What she needed was the medical documentation to establish that the cognitive symptoms were induced, not natural, that the psychiatric evaluation describing you as mentally diminished was describing a condition that someone had manufactured." She looked at Clara. "We worked together for 6 months, putting this portion of the record together. Everything in that folder is admissible. Chain of custody is documented. I will testify to all of it." Clara put her hand on Dr. Okafor's arm briefly, the gesture of two people who had been through something difficult together and had come out the other side of it. I opened the folder and looked at the numbers. 4 years of my own blood, documented in columns telling a story that I had been living without being able to read. The trembling hands, the slow thoughts, the mornings when my own name felt like a word I had to search for rather than simply know. I had been 60 years old, and I had told myself I was aging, and I had thanked the woman who was causing it for the coffee she handed me every morning. The anger that moved through me was not hot. It was the cold, structural kind, the kind that settles into the load-bearing parts of a person and stays there. I recognized it as the same thing I felt the first time I ever saw a building that had been wired incorrectly, where someone had taken shortcuts that put people at risk for the sake of saving time or money. A clean, technical fury at deliberate negligence, at someone who knew better and chose wrong anyway. Daniel appeared beside the table. He had his phone in his hand and the expression of a man delivering the final item on a list. Webb made his statement an hour ago, he said. Full cooperation. He confirmed the psychiatric evaluation was falsified under duress. Mark had documentation on a malpractice settlement Webb had buried 15 years ago and used it to compel the signature. He looked at me. With Webb's testimony, Okafor's medical record, and the financial forensics we've been building for 18 months, the case is complete. Wire fraud, identity theft, deed fraud, insurance fraud, elder abuse, kidnapping, conspiracy. He paused. The U.S. Attorney's Office will file charges this morning. I sat in the corner booth of my closed restaurant at 3 a.m, with my daughter beside me and my family doctor across the table, and a federal agent standing at the edge of the light. And I looked at the folder in my hands and thought about 22 years of building something in this room, of feeding people, of Clara doing her homework at this table, and learning to read circuit diagrams on slow Tuesday afternoons. They had tried to take all of it. The money, the building, the clarity of my own mind, the years I had left. They had not succeeded. Not because I was clever, though Clara was. Not because I was powerful, though Daniel was. Because a 20-year-old blood panel had been kept in a filing cabinet by a doctor who believed that records were sacred. Because a 71-year-old woman had been watching from an upstairs window. Because a 63-year-old retired electrician had once installed a toggle switch behind a false panel and never told anyone about it. Because small, careful things done with integrity and left to wait had a way of surviving. I looked up from the folder. Through the front window of the restaurant above the tilted sign and the dark buildings across Merrick Boulevard, the sky had begun to change. Not light yet. Something earlier than light. The particular deep blue that arrives before dawn in a city when the darkness has reached its furthest point and begun imperceptibly to recede. Clara followed my gaze. She saw it too. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey," I said. "We made it to morning," she said. I looked at my daughter sitting in the cracked vinyl corner booth where she had done her homework for 12 years in the restaurant we had built together, and I said, "Yeah, we did." The Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse on Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan was the kind of building that had been designed to make you feel the weight of what happened inside it before you even reached the door. It was a January morning, cold in the specific way that Lower Manhattan is cold in January, the wind coming off the East River and finding every gap in your coat with the efficient thoroughness of something that has been doing this for a very long time and has gotten good at it. Clara walked beside me up the courthouse steps with her shoulder close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth of her through both our winter coats. That small warmth. 3 months of it now. 3 months of her being in the same city, the same borough, the same rooms as me, and I had not yet reached the point where I took it for granted, and I did not intend to. Ruth Cassidy was already inside second row aisle seat, the position of someone who had arrived early and chosen strategically. She was wearing her good coat, the charcoal one she reserved for occasions that required it. And when she saw us come through the door, she gave me the small, firm nod of a woman who had been watching out for something for a long time and was glad to see it arrive. Dr. Okafor sat 3 seats down from Ruth. She had her hands folded on her lap and her eyes straight ahead, and the composed, upright posture of a physician when preparing to testify, which she had done 2 months prior, with the same steady precision she had brought to everything. Clara and I took the front row. The proceedings began at 9 o'clock precisely. Judge Miriam Howell, compact and gray-haired and carrying her authority the way certain people carry it, as though it were simply part of their natural weight, and they had never had to think about it, opened the session without ceremony. Mark Calloway sat at the defense table in a dark suit that fit him well and looked at the bench with an expression of composed attention. He had retained one of the better white-collar defense firms in the city, which had not helped him as much as he had perhaps anticipated, given the scope of what the government had put together. 18 months of financial forensics, federal wiretap recordings, Webb's testimony, Dr. Okafor's medical records, Diane's full cooperation statement, the deed fraud documentation from the Queens County clerk, Clara's 5 years of evidence organized with the same careful precision she had brought to everything since she was 12 years old, reading circuit diagrams at a corner table. Some cases, by the time they reach sentencing, are no longer about what happened. They are simply about the accounting. Judge Howell read the sentence for Mark Calloway first. 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for the first 15. Consecutive sentences on the wire fraud, identity theft, and kidnapping, counts the judge noted, given the deliberate and sustained nature of the conspiracy and the particular vulnerability of the victim. Mark did not react visibly. He had the face of a man who had already processed this outcome and moved on to calculating what came next. He would appeal. He would find angles. He would be... I suspected the kind of prisoner who organized things, who found leverage, who made himself useful in whatever environment he was placed in. Some people's essential nature was simply more durable than the circumstances they found themselves in. I looked at him for the last time as they led him out, and felt nothing in particular, which was not what I had expected. I had expected anger or satisfaction, or some version of the closure that people describe when justice is delivered. What I felt instead was the particular flatness of a circuit that has been properly resolved, every connection accounted for, the system balanced and done. Not empty, just finished. Diane was brought in separately for her sentencing. She had changed in 3 months. Not dramatically. She was still composed, still upright, still wearing the boardroom posture that had been her primary mode of presentation for as long as I had known her. But something in the composition was different, something in the specific quality of her stillness. The armor I had watched fail in the restaurant that October morning had been rebuilt, but it had been rebuilt from different materials. It did not look the same from the inside. 20 years, Judge Howell said, with credit for full cooperation and the early guilty plea on all counts, eligibility for review after 12. Diane stood and received this with her chin level and her hands quiet at her sides. Then she turned. She did not look at Clara. She looked at me. Directly, without flinching, the way she had looked at me across 31 years of kitchen tables and restaurant counters and difficult conversations. The particular direct gaze of a woman who had never in her life been willing to look away from anything she had decided to face. I did not know what she was looking for. I did not know what she found. What I knew was that I looked back because she was a woman I had spent 31 years of my life with, and whatever she had done, that was true, and I was not going to be the one who looked away first. 3 seconds. Then the marshal's hand came to her elbow, gentle and impersonal, and she turned and walked toward the door and did not look back. Clara's hand found mine on the armrest between us. She did not squeeze it. She simply placed her hand over mine and left it there, which was enough, which was more than enough. Outside the courthouse on Pearl Street, the January wind was sharp and direct, and the sky above the buildings was the particular pale blue of a cold, clear morning in New York, the kind of blue that offered no warmth, but was beautiful anyway, the way honest things often are. Ruth appeared beside me on the steps and tucked her hand through my arm without asking permission, which was very Ruth. "Breakfast," she said. It was not a suggestion. Breakfast, Clara agreed from my other side. Dr. Okafor came through the door behind us and pulled her coat closed against the wind and looked at the four of us on the courthouse steps and said with the dry precision phone of a woman who had been waiting to say something for 3 months. I know a place on Fulton Street. The coffee is real and the eggs are not small. I looked at these 3 women standing on the steps of a federal courthouse in January, and I thought about all the different ways a person could be saved without knowing they were being saved. About Ruth watching from an upstairs window, and Dr. Okafor keeping a filing cabinet, and Clara sitting outside in a car on a March evening that I had spent alone inside, believing I was simply getting older. Lead the way, I said. The deed to the property at Merrick Boulevard came back to me on a Wednesday morning in February, 3 weeks after the sentencing. A paralegal from the U.S. Attorney's Office brought it to the restaurant in person, which I thought was a kind thing to do. She was perhaps 25 years old, and she handed me the document with both hands and said the fraudulent sale contract had been voided by the court, and the title was clear, and the building was mine. And I thanked her, and she left, and I stood in the empty restaurant with the deed in my hands for a long time before I set it down on the counter and picked up a paintbrush. Clara had already been there for 2 hours. She had shown up at 7 in the morning with coffee from the place on Merrick that had opened while the restaurant was closed, 2 cups in a cardboard carrier, and the particular expression of a woman who had decided what was going to happen next and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. She had pulled the dust covers off the shelves along the back wall and folded them in a neat stack near the door. And she was standing on a step stool, repainting the trim above the front window, in the same shade of dark red it had always been. Her hair tucked under a baseball cap that had seen better decades. "You're going to drip on the floor," I said. "I know," she said. "That's what floors are for." We worked for 6 weeks. Not every day Clara had started a new position at a financial advocacy nonprofit in Brooklyn. The kind of work she had always done helping families understand the systems that were supposed to serve them. And she came to the restaurant on weekends and 2 evenings a week, and brought Joey Ruiz sometimes, who turned out to be useful with a paint roller, and who worked with the focused, slightly desperate energy of a young man who needed to feel that he was making something right. I rewired the entire building from scratch, not because it needed it. The wiring I had put in 22 years ago was sound and would have lasted another 20. I did it because I wanted to. Because I wanted to stand in the utility room with a new panel and new circuits and know that everything in this building was built by me and served the purpose it was built for and had no hidden compartments and no concealed switches and no secondary systems that only I knew about. A clean circuit. Start to finish, nothing hidden. I left one thing in place. The corner booth with the cracked vinyl seat. The crack gives it character, Dad. Some things you don't fix. You just keep using them. The morning we opened, it snowed, not heavily. The kind of light, dry snow that comes to New York in early March and does not commit to anything, just drifts across the sidewalk in loose suggestion and melts before noon. Clara was already behind the counter when I arrived, the coffee maker running, and the smell of it filling the room the way it had filled it on every ordinary morning for 22 years before everything stopped. She had put a small sign in the window. White cardstock, black letters hand-lettered in the careful printing she had inherited from me. Hensley's Family Kitchen. Open. And below that, in smaller letters, the date we had first opened, and the date we were opening again, with a dash between them, that contained in its small horizontal length everything that had happened in the space between. Ruth Cassidy arrived at 8:15. She came through the door in her good coat and took the corner booth without being invited and ordered coffee and eggs and said that the trim above the window looked very well done, and she was glad the H on the sign had been straightened. Frankie Ruiz came at 9 in his postal uniform, technically still on his route, and technically not supposed to stop, which had never once stopped Frankie from doing anything he had decided to do. He sat at the counter and drank his coffee standing up because he said he couldn't stay, but then stayed for 40 minutes and told Clara 3 separate times that she had her father's stubbornness, which Clara took as the compliment it was intended to be. Joey came in at noon on his lunch break and ate a full plate of eggs and toast and looked around the room with the expression of someone who was trying to decide if what he was feeling was relief or pride or something that did not have a common name, and settled on eating a second piece of toast. I spent most of that first morning behind the counter. Not because there was so much to do, the morning crowd was modest neighbors who had seen the sign go up and stopped in out of curiosity or loyalty or both. People who remembered the restaurant from before and wanted to see if it was the same. It was not entirely the same. The menu was simpler. The hours were shorter. Clara had suggested we close at 2 in the afternoon on weekdays, which was practical and also kind, because it meant we were never too tired at the end of a day to sit down together in the corner booth and eat something before we went home. Around 11, during a quiet stretch between customers, I found myself standing at the end of the counter looking at the room. The morning light came through the front windows in long, pale rectangles across the floor, the kind of winter light that is thin and cool, but honest, that does not flatter anything, but shows you what is actually there. What was actually there was Clara at the corner table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, making notes for something related to her nonprofit work. Her handwriting moving across the page in the same careful loops it had always moved in since she was old enough to hold a pen. The cracked vinyl booth, the dark red trim above the windows, the smell of coffee and something on the stove. Ruth in the corner with her good coat folded on the seat beside her reading a newspaper and looking entirely at home. The ordinary components of an ordinary morning. I had spent 5 years believing that ordinary mornings were something that happened to other people. That the particular unremarkable texture of a day without crisis was a thing I had used up my allocation of and would not get back. I picked up the cloth from the counter and wiped down a surface that was already clean. Clara looked up from her legal pad. She looked at me across the room with her mother's eyes, the first mother, the one I had loved, and she said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and I said nothing back, and we held that for a moment, the two of us in the morning light of a room we had rebuilt together. Then the door opened, and a woman I did not recognize came in out of the March snow, stamping her boots on the mat, unwinding her scarf, looking around with the slightly hopeful expression of someone who needed a warm place to sit and a cup of something hot, and had stumbled across both at exactly the right moment. "Are you open?" she said. "Yes," Clara said, already reaching for a mug. "Sit anywhere you like." I looked up at the sign above the door. Clara had painted it herself the week before we opened on an afternoon, when I had been rewiring the back panel, and she had been working at the counter with brushes and a steady hand. The main sign was the same as it had always been, but below the name in small letters painted in the same dark red as the trim, she had added a single line. I turned back to the counter. There were cups to fill and a stove to tend, and a morning to get through, which was all any day ever really asked of you when you stripped it down to what it actually was. I got to work. Looking back on this grandpa story, I realize how blind a man can become inside his own house. I trusted completely. I looked at the people sharing my table every single day and never once asked what was underneath the smiles. Do not be like me. Pay attention to the ones closest to you, because family betrayal never announces itself. It arrives quietly, wearing the face of someone who loves you, offering to help with your finances, pouring your morning coffee. This family story taught me something I could not have learned any other way. Love without wisdom is simply a door left open. I believe that truth has a way of surviving, no matter how carefully it is buried. And I believe God placed the right people in the right windows at exactly the right moment. Clara, Ruth, Patricia, Frankie. None of it happens without them. If this grandpa story moved something in you, leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done differently. Share this family story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed so you never miss what comes next, because the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. I mean that. A note: before we continue the stories ahead, carry some fictional elements carefully woven in to make the message land the way it deserves. If that is not what you came for, no hard feelings at all. Step away and find what serves you better. But if you're still here, I think you already know why.